This is Warren Bird, and I'm talking with one of my mentors, Dr. Elmer Towns, who's written, I always think the latest book that I've read of him is the best, but this one absolutely is, The 10 Most Influential Churches of the Past Century. Dr. Towns, what prompted you to try to cover a whole century in your writing?
Well, for years, I've taught the Doctor of Ministries courses here at Liberty University. And one day, a student asked me the question. He said, of all the churches of the past 100 years, which one was the most influential? And so I started throwing out some names about this and that. And all of a sudden, I said, if he's interested, and by the way, the class got into it. They said, well, what about First Baptist Dallas? Or what about this church? And they started asking different questions. And so I said, I'm going to find them. And so that motivated me. A question by a student. That's the same thing. Way back in about 1968, a student at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School asked me a question. Who is the largest church in America? And I told him it was First Baptist Dallas. He said, no, it's Jack Hyles. And a guy in the back of the room said, you're both wrong. It's a hillbilly church in Akron, Ohio. And we laughed at it. And then I said, I'm going to find them. So that student asked who would be the most, and so I found, and I called it the 10 most influential churches in the past 100 years or the past century. Now, it actually goes back to about 1900. And so we begin there. But when you talk about it, I put a list together. And each year I would have these classes. And so each year I have about 60 to 100 doctoral ministry students. And they would go over my list, and we would add and take away. And I figured these pastors working on a doctor's degree might be the best source to find out about churches. So that was my research, these pastors. We came up with a list of 50, and then we whittled it down. They kept voting until we got to the 10. And I'm pretty much agreed with their 10, that these 10 are the best churches, are the most influential churches for an impact they made immediately or long run.
Well, and the 10 and the churches you highlight, everyone gives a window into a different trend, into a different emphasis,
Right.
into a different method that God was using, into a different type of outreach. And it's an absolutely fascinating read. I take issue with you on one thing, and that's what you put at the very back of the book, and you called it an afterthought, where you talk about, hey, what did we learn from the different pastors? And to me, that was the most fun part of all, because it wasn't an afterthought. It was, okay, now let me pull all this together and say, what common themes could be found in all of these churches? And what you highlight, from vision as in the heart of the pastor to the apt methodologies, was just gold. But what I want to dig with you, because I'm going to describe the book in my write-up, I want to ask many pastors today, like, they network with each other. They use social media, they text each other, and they kind of know each other. Was that the case way back when, that the leading pastors in different cities, did they too share ideas, encourage each other? Did they kind of form networks?
Absolutely. When you begin to look at the very first church, a little Azusa Street could only seat 300 people. It was active for maybe 7 years total, but they had everybody in the country, in the world, coming there to experience the Holy Spirit, the baptism. They wanted to see tongues. They wanted to see what was happening there. Now, media played a role. William Seymour had been seeking tongues all over the place. And finally he got it. And almost immediately, on a Tuesday night, he preached, and there was an evidence of tongues, and there was a Los Angeles Times reporter there. And the report was very racist. They called them darkies. It was against darkies and whites hugging together at the altar. And it put them down. It called them all types of names for their lunacy and the things that they were doing, and about speaking in tongues. Well, anyway, that night, William Seymour predicted there was going to be a great earthquake hit California. And that would show that God was saying that the end time was coming. 2 days later, San Francisco was hit with an earthquake and 10,000 people died. And that gave credibility. the newspaper 2 days later gave credibility around the world, and people said, we better listen to this man. Now, it's interesting. I think that was of God to bring it about. And so now, but the trouble is you have everyone coming to see it. Many people came, saw it, went back and duplicated the same thing. There are about 19 denominations that came out of that group. 19 denominations. And when you begin to say, wow, 19 denominations, that's a lot of groups. Today, maybe the Assembly of God is the largest of all denominations. They have about 240,000 churches around the world. Maybe the second largest denomination in the world is Foursquare. They have over 90,000 churches around the world. And so if you're going to count largest in the world, that's different than counting largest in the United States.
Wow. So out of one church, you have what today is 1 out of 4 people who say they follow Christ identify with the Pentecostal movement. So now today, churches have kind of a very sophisticated how we do it seminar, and they have brochures that highlight it and online presence to draw people in. Was it primarily, you say, the newspapers that drew attention, and then different pastors got to know each other by being present with each other? Is that how it worked?
Well, I think at Azusa Street, they went there to get it, to get the tongues. They got it. They went back and duplicated that in the lives of other people. So it was the experience they got. Now, people go to like to Bill Hybels. He had the conferences each year, and people would go and learn and see what he was doing, and they would feel the experience of God at work, and they went back and they duplicated the same thing. The same thing with Thomas Road Baptist Church. Now, Schofield Memorial Church, it's interesting, in all of their votes, Schofield always came out very high among all the doctoral students because of the impact of the Bible church movement. Now, not so much of conferences, except Schofield himself was traveling to these Bible conferences all over the country, and they would hear him speak, and he was probably electrifying, not so much by his methodology, but electrifying by what he had to say. And therefore, he communicated a method by what he said, and of course, through his Bible. Through his reference Bible. I got to be careful what I say on that.
Right, and you point out that Oxford Press printed 2 million of the Schofield reference Bibles in that initial period, which is just amazing. So now let me ask about training of future ministers in these churches. Today, the rage is, internships, residencies, ministers in training. Did these kind of superstar churches that you mentioned, how did they do leadership development?
I think they did it the same way, without a program, without titles, without organization. It was just done by ministry. They learned a type of ministry by doing a type of ministry. And therefore, the students at Dallas Seminary went to hear Schofield and went back and built that type of a church around the world. The same thing about the Southern Baptists. Southern Baptists had a type of ministry, and it was pretty much the same type in all of their seminaries. And of course, I use Dallas not as the beginner of a movement, but as the capstone, the topstone of the movement. And so I said, Dallas really personifies why the Southern Baptists became so large.
So let's talk about the idea of succession. Today, it's very much, even among denominational churches, that the outgoing senior pastor, as much as possible, tries to mentor, train, have an overlap with the person that the baton is being passed to. Way back when, in these different stellar churches that you highlight, how did they do succession? And talk about the life cycle of these churches. Did they continue?
Well, two things you asked. You asked about life cycle. Of course, I've done a lot of study on the life cycle of churches, comparing it to the life cycle of trees and bushes and plants and human bodies. God has a life cycle for all of them. And it seems as though a church has a life cycle. And you go all the way back to Trelch, almost 200 years ago, the sociological cycle of church growth and death. And it seems like every church, like every baby that's born, eventually will die, because as they begin to grow, they grow towards full maturity, but full maturity has the seeds of death in it, just like the seeds of life were the original. So I think in these churches, we see life and death. Now, Seymour, that first Azusa Street, began to kill his own church when he changed the focus. And the focus was primarily the tongues, the experience. And he changed to make the focus racial equality, because he felt the sting of racial equality. And as he turned it, eventually what happened is, by trying to bring in more and more of the races all into one church, it ended up being just a black church. And it ended up just going out of existence. So, in other words, sometimes the cause we seek becomes more important, the seeking, than the cause itself. So Seymour, I think, hurt himself. Now, some of the other churches, you asked me about their cycle. How do they grow? How do they succession? If you look at these churches, a lot of them hurt themselves because they didn't have a good succession. No one knows that better than I do in the 10 largest Sunday schools. 1969, the 10 flagship churches in America had huge Sunday schools. Everybody's going to study them, seeing what they were doing for God. Now, some of those churches had 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 in attendance. For instance, Highland Park Baptist Church had over 5,000. It went down to 200. And you think in terms of Cincinnati, Landmark Baptist Temple had over 4,000. It went down to under 1,000. Some of these, Akron Baptist Temple today had over 6,000. Today, they're right under 1,000. So, why did these happen? Because of poor succession. The man who took over didn't have the heart or the method, but probably the values. That's the key phrase. The values of ministry that the founder had.
Powerful. One last question. International influence. You mentioned a few overseas churches in your profiles. Is it U.S. for the last century? Is it that the United States was influencing overseas? Was it that they were birthing things coming back here? Talk about the two-way street or the one-way street.
Well, when we in America send out missionaries, we are trying to transplant Western Christianity. And Western Christianity is not the same. It doesn't have the same value system as Oriental Christianity, or as Hispanic Christianity, or as African Christianity. The pastors dress differently. They value time differently. They value so many different things differently. And some of the strongest churches around the world today are not Western birthed or Western driven. They are driven by the values and attitudes of planted Christianity, so that the seed that was planted is grown in these foreign soils, and they are completely indigenous, completely nationalized. And so God blesses them. Now, for instance, the Hillsong Church, great, strong church because of praise worship music. I love that church, and it was that because of the Hillsong. Then I mentioned 2 or 3 other churches and what they look at China. I am so amazed. More than I read about China, they have no denominational affiliation. They have no outside ordination. They have no buildings. Everything that Western Christianity values, they don't have, and yet they're the strongest church in the world, maybe strongest in the world. And so they have just no oversight. They just have very strong churches there. And why is that? Because the gospel is the power of God to salvation, to transform people. It's the gospel we preach, and it's the gospel that does it.
Well, on that note, it will be interesting 100 years from now, if Jesus hasn't returned, to see someone else write a book, or to imagine them writing a book, and to see if it's very much a global book of the 100.
I'll write it.
Only you could have written the book you did. You have probably visited more of these churches, been up close, watched firsthand, interviewed, tracked over time, know the difference between sometimes the hype and the reality. I am so thankful you wrote this book. I cannot enthusiastically enough recommend it. And it's Elmer Towns, 10 of today's, hold up that book title if you would again, 10 of the 10 most influential churches of the past century. Dr. Towns, you've given a great gift, in not only in your life and mentoring of me and of tens of thousands of others, but this book is another crowning jewel for you.
I don't call it mentoring. I call it walking together in ministry to serve the Lord. That's the important thing. Thank you, friend.